check the sound, please. So I'll be helping you to prepare in a very systematic manner the sections of history, including both Indian history and history of modern world. And today we'll be doing the history of modern India, British rule, associated aspects. Because this is the first class, I would like to tell you the orientation for mains answer writing and what that will be our approach. Why? Because we have limited time in terms of classes or the videos that you will get, and also the approach has to be such that your marks in GS paper 1 is maximized. The good part about GS paper 1 is that a significant portion of GS paper 1 is from the static area. Even Indian society also, out of say 6-7 questions which are asked, 4 questions, 5 questions can be mastered. Hence I always recommend students that you should prepare in a way that you should aim for not less than 115 to 120 marks in GS paper 1 while also mastering other areas. And it can be done. The good thing is it can be done. Uncertainty element is less, provided we prepare in a systematic manner and we do focused and differentiated answer writing. That is also a part of this program. So tomorrow we will have the first answer writing session based on whatever we cover, largely the portions today. And we also have a class tomorrow also, Modern India. So in 5 hours that we have, 5.5 hours, we'll be doing the most important, and we will try to create a edge in terms of content. The objective of this session is not to teach you the movements which you have already covered in your prelims examination, you are aware of, but to develop and think along the lines that will help you to fetch higher marks. Right? There are 3 things which are very important when it comes to answer writing in history, GS. Very, very important. And you should focus on these 3 aspects of answer writing and prepare also along these aspects. So what are the 3 aspects? And you would see that our preparation and our discussion would be along these lines. Agreed? The 3 aspects which are very, very important. For history answers, whether it is in any part of history. First is, your answers must have arguments. Yes, content fact is required, no doubt about that, but it must have arguments. You must explain the why factor very well. Very, very well. Do not just believe that if you know what any historical underpinning and you just mention that, you will end up getting higher marks. No. I'll give you an example. For example, they ask a question on non-cooperation movement. Agreed? So generally what we do is that we have read a lot about non-cooperation movement, the causes, the course, the nature. Agreed? And we tend to write everything about it. Tilak Swaraj Fund, Nagpur Resolution, the spread of the movement. But even if the question is about the nature of the movement, you would be appreciated if you focus on why and in what ways the non-cooperation movement was a radical departure from the extremist Swadeshi movement, how it was the beginning of Gandhian leadership on pan-India scale, and how it defined and changed the course of the movement. It is very, very important. That is very, very important. That is what I call as arguments. For every question, and today you would see that when we will discuss different aspects of modern India, we would focus on the argument part more. Because I am very confident that you are in mastery of the content. मतलब आपको historical जो development है वो पता है. But we have to understand the argument aspect. The second thing is dimensions. Because in your GS paper 1, you will be awarded for writing and for generating more and more dimensions. It can happen. Psychological, political, economic, administrative, cultural. In modern India, wherever it is required and possible, Try to write along multiple dimensions. Agreed? And third thing, which is going to make your answer more enriched and slightly different from the others, is evidences. Very, very important. So today, I'm sure that you would have noticed that I've uploaded this handout. You can download it also from the portal. You can request. So what I have done is that in every topic, as far as possible, अगर आप मैंने mention नहीं किया है, I will make you note down. I have given references of important findings, important quotations, famous quotations, books. There have been books which have been written in the recent times also, which have been in news. And if you mention that, all the works of the famous personalities, for example, मैं आपको example देता हूं. If you have to write about Gandhi ji and his views on economy, then you must quote Hind Swaraj. It is important. If you are writing about Subhash Chandra Bose, you must talk about his speeches in Japan, his famous speech in 1944 Tokyo, his book The Indian Struggle, and what is mentioned there. If you are writing about the plight of peasants in 19th century Bengal, where Indigo revolt happened, earlier Sannyasi rebellion happened, then possibly it would be great if you can mention about Munshi Premchand's Godan. That is what we are going to learn. That we will develop these dimensions, and for every topic. That is why, if you see that I have developed this handout in a way so that most of the things, I would not say everything. देखिए कुछ मैंने पेजेस छोड़ दिए हैं, but otherwise if you notice, most of the things, most of the important keywords I have mentioned, so that in the class I will have to make you write less and we can discuss, and wherever possible I will request you to mention. समझ गए? So third is, this is what will make your answer a very good one, is evidences. आप बस ये तीनों चीजें कर लीजिए, and then we will understand and internalize how to write very good answers. We will do that through practice, through live answer writing session tomorrow. ठीक है? Second, it is very difficult to predict, but again, based on whatever we have seen and we understand, certain areas are very, very important, which you must focus more now. Possibly at the end, you can just go through the Indian national movement. So we believe that the commission will be asking more questions from the establishment of British rule, British policies, the effect of British rule in India, their initiatives, and then various aspects of the Indian freedom struggle, 19th century, all of this. And why? Possibly one of the reasons, because over the initial stages from 2013, they may have asked many questions from Indian national movement. So you should be prepared for the uncharted territory also. That is why in the handout, I have not mentioned much about the movements, but I recommend students that before you go on to write, the mains examination, एक बार, just through whatever book you had mentioned, read for your prelims, एक बार देख के चले जाइएगा. So that if a question is asked from a very predictable and a generic area, so you should not miss out. Agreed? अभी आप इस पर focus कीजिए. The themes which we have mentioned, which we have curated for you, that is, I would say, that would be covering the difficult and the analytical part. ठीक है? That is what I have to suggest to you. So, first is establishment of British rule in India. Establishment of British rule in India. Now, let me ask you two things. That when we talk about the establishment of British rule in India, what type of questions can be expected? Because I don't expect them to start asking questions on the wars. They will not say that discuss the factors leading to the first Anglo-Maratha war. Or I believe that the question that what is the significance of Battle of Plassey is too generic. So there are two questions which or there are two aspects which I would want to cover, is that one, was the British establishment of British rule planned? Planned, or it was accidental, or driven by circumstances? एक ये क्वेश्चन बन सकता है, बिकॉज देर इज एन एंटायर चैप्टर, बंगाल, अवध, बक्सर सब है, मराठाज, सिंध. So based on whatever you have read, how would you address this one, that was the establishment of British rule in India planned or accidental? आपको क्या लगता है? First is this question, and second, why the British, you can write East India Company, were able to prevail over the native states and other European powers. Through these two questions, we will try to understand how did they establish their rule in India. So tell me quickly, all of you, those who are watching this live also can contribute. Was the establishment of British rule in India planned, or was it accidental, or something that happened due to the prevailing circumstances? How would you answer this? Please, just recollect. Online students, how would you answer this? This, आप इधर बैठ जाइए ना, because the camera may be, yes. How do you address this? Was the establishment of British rule in India planned, or it was accidental? तो मान लीजिए लिखना होता, if you have to write, how would you write? If this is a, say, 10 marker question, 12 marker question, how would you write this? They came to trade. They did not have an idea to establish the empire. Then so they saw opportunities, that there is prevailing tensions amongst the Indians, and they started exploiting it. And then you write examples, Bengal, Maratha. ये लिखेंगे आप? You write this? ये लिखेंगे ना? Will you give an account of all the wars they have fought? Will you give an account of all the wars they have fought? How to make it a very good, or what to write so that it looks like a very complete argument? First thing, you must learn that for your answer writing, we have to be creative, so that the person who is reading is also able to understand that you can convey more through less. We do not have the scope of writing everything. Now, there will be many questions across your history where we will be covering a big span of time. We will not be focusing on one event. This is one such question. A question which is in the form of a evolution. Agreed? Means it is actually flowing. British came to India 1608, agreed, and then till, you can say, till 1857, a lot of things have happened, agreed, which we are going to analyze. So I would recommend that in every such question, we must, yes, very good Vinny, we must start with a timeline diagram. समझिए, I'm not going to draw it for you, but आपको यहां से पता होना चाहिए, timeline diagram means from 1608 to 1757, we see that East India Company are purely a commercial entity. ध्यान दीजिए, agreed? Purely a commercial entity. So timeline 1757, conquest of Bengal. Then 1764, East India Company de jure power in Bengal, Awadh. De jure means legal. Then guys, you write 1767 to 1799. We will write 3 Anglo-Mysore wars. Agreed? You don't have to write everything. 3 Anglo-Mysore wars. Then you would also write 1775 to 1818. 3 Anglo-Maratha wars. Agreed? ये हुआ था ना? Then you would write William Bentinck annexation policy, annexation of Coorg, Mysore, etc. 1830s, ऐसे लिखिए. Then we find Anglo-Punjab wars. (1845 to 47). नहीं. Then Dalhousie's doctrine of lapse, doctrine of misgovernance, and then 1857, 1858 Crown's rule. So सबसे पहले, if you don't know anything, I would recommend that you must come up with a timeline. Why? Because that will give a complete picture of what has happened. You do not have the scope of writing everything. Now coming to the argument. क्या हो गया? है? अच्छा, you're writing. That's okay. Coming to the argument. How to write on this? So agreed, there are two set of views. British historians and British will never accept that it was planned, or there was nothing that was directed from the Crown or the British Parliament. Even if initiatives were taken, it was by the British or East India Company officials on their own. They were able to exploit circumstances. And also, we have to explain that the British policies in India was driven by other factors also. Means if you look at from the colonial perspective, they would say that we never had the desire to exploit, because when they established the British rule, they presented it as a noble civilizing mission. Agreed? They would never say this. So when you have to write this, once you have written the introduction, that the establishment of British rule in India underwent multiple phases, then you have to write two set of arguments. आपको ऐसे आंसर लिखना है. You don't have to write the narrative of Bengal, because that is something that your timeline has taken care of. Agreed? Once you draw this timeline diagram, it has taken care of all the words which you would have spent on the explanation. So the arguments are in two directions. अब इसमें क्या है कि what will make your answer very well? If you can remember certain quotations, which I have given in the handout also. Quotations, not much, but when it comes to these, type of questions, establishment of British political rule in India, and they are very famous and common, and you can integrate them in your answer, then obviously it will look better. So which are those quotations? जैसे एक मैंने लिख रखा है, जॉन सीले का स्टेटमेंट है, the statement of John Seeley that British conquered India in a fit of absent-mindedness. This is the statement that British conquered India in a fit of absent-mindedness. मतलब it was not planned. फिर there is another, you can remember any of them. C.A. Bailey. C.A. Bailey says that 18th century India was a fragmented polity. And this political vacuum was exploited by East India Company officials. ये भी आप लिख सकते हैं. और there are people who have said, like P.J. Marshall, that establishment of British rule, I'm writing in short, was due to the initiatives of East India Company officials, which you can call as sub-imperialism. So we have to use certain keywords also. Sub-imperialism. So when you start by your part, the colonial arguments, तो आप इस आंसर को तीन भाग में रखेंगे. First is the introduction, and then the colonial argument. And you can mention either of them. You don't have to remember. I have mentioned in the handout also that either of them. Now, what are the colonial arguments? What are the colonial arguments? What do they say about the establishment of British rule in India? तो वो कहते हैं, they say that the establishment of British rule in India or the transition of East India Company from a commercial power to a political entity was driven by following circumstances and factors. समझिए. First, they start talking about the important conquests. So they say that the conquest of Bengal, when they talk about the conquest of Bengal, so they say that the conquest of Bengal was more like a transaction. It was not a conquest. It was a transaction in which the merchants, bankers, and the gentry of Bengal negotiated with the East India Company for their own benefit. So they say that the blame is not on us. आपको पूरी कहानी मालूम है. So when they talk about the conquest of Bengal, because we study that the conquest of Bengal was not actually a war, Battle of Plassey, it was a great betrayal. How do the British represent it? They say that it was a transaction. They say that it was a transaction in which the bankers, merchants, and the gentry, along with people like Mir Jafar, they colluded with East India Company officials, you know the story, for their own benefit. In fact, you must somewhere also mention this, and this is very famous, I'm telling you the argument. Many have written, historians have written that 18th century and early 19th century political history of India was actually witnessing a competition collaboration syndrome. Not only in the case of Bengal, but there are numerous instances where a section of or influential section in a state, they collaborated with the British. It has happened. You can call them betrayers, you can call them whatever, but it is a theory. So you can mention it also that not only this, the conquest of Bengal, but 18th century witnessed a collaboration competition syndrome. There are numerous examples, especially the capitalist class who could see a brighter future with the East India Company. They started supporting their ventures. Then guys, so you should mention this competition collaboration syndrome. Then the Anglo-Maratha war. How do the British justify the Anglo-Maratha wars? They justify the Anglo-Maratha war as a war of opportunity. They say that why we fought the Anglo-Maratha war is because there was internal disunity and they invited us to join. You have read that Raghunath Rao signed a treaty of Surat and invited the Bombay governor to help him. So that is why British said that we were never intending to intervene. It was something that they did it, and hence we had to. Second, they write that the Anglo-Mysore war were wars of threat. They say that why did we conquer Mysore? Because there was a threat. And what is the threat? Threat was that there was a French Mysore nexus that was developing. Earlier in the time of Hyder Ali, अब देखिए आपको पता सब कुछ होगा, but you don't have to write everything. You cannot write everything. हाँ, यहाँ पे आप लिख सकते हैं that possibly they were threatened that there is going to be some type of nexus between Tipu Sultan and Napoleon. You can write that. Or even before that, Hyder Ali, who set up a modern arsenal factory in Dindigal, was held by French. So they could sense. And second reason why they conquered Mysore was because of Tipu Sultan's mercantilism. Tipu Sultan, he established the monopoly of the state on important trade commodities like pepper. So British realized that they were unable to do free trade in Mysore. The important ports were controlled, the trade monopolies, so they had to do it. So they don't see it as planned. They see that it is driven by circumstances. Then, guys, they talk about conquest of Sindh. Was due to the Great Game. See how we are writing, connecting world history and Indian history. Due to the Great Game. What is the Great Game? Between British versus Russia. Russians were trying to establish control over Central Asia, Persia, so that they can get access to Arabian Sea, warm water diplomacy. So earlier they had tried to capture Afghanistan, but they failed. So now they have settled with Sindh, so that to stabilize. Then you have to write that the British East India Company stable frontier policy was also the driving factor for their expansion. What is stable frontier policy? Stable frontier policy, अब यहां पर आप creative हो सकते हैं. You can write that to protect their core regions, they will there are buffer territories which have to be captured. For example, to stabilize Bengal, they have to establish control over Awadh. To maintain or to protect Madras, they have to establish control over Carnatic. इसको कहते हैं stable frontier policy. Then you would write that the British East India Company policies in India was also influenced by European politics. So they are saying that our political policies, our expansionist policy was also influenced by European politics. Can you give me an example? Austrian War of Succession is linked with the Carnatic Wars. 7 Years War is linked with the Third Carnatic War. है ना? So you can say, they are saying that sometimes we had to be involved in a political affair because our adversary, especially France, was creating a headache. तो आप लिख सकते हो Austrian War of Succession, you can link it with the first and second Carnatic War, at least the first Carnatic War, and the 7 Years War, 1756 to 63, linking with the third Carnatic War. So, guys, you see that how we are writing in a way that we are giving their justification. अगर आप इसको पढ़ के देखें तो बिल्कुल लगता है that the British established their political rule in India not in a planned manner, but it was accidental and driven by circumstances. And then the last argument is the role of sub-imperialism. Role of sub-imperialism means it says that the British rule in India was because of the suo motu initiatives of certain East India Company officials, suo motu initiatives, who acted on their own. Example, you can write Clive in Bengal. You can write Wellesley's subsidiary alliance. बहुत एग्जाम्पल देने की कभी जरूरत नहीं है. You don't have to write all the examples, you have to give more arguments. यहां पे आप लिख सकते हैं doctrine of lapse. So first part, you have to write the colonial argument. This is how you must write. आप याद रखिएगा ये सर. Now, what is the counter argument? What is the nationalist argument? What is the nationalist argument? First, that East India Company trade in India was not pure trade, it was from the beginning armed trade. Agreed? From the beginning it was armed trade. They were never a purely commercial entity. Second, East India Company was granted a charter and provided military support by the British government. Agreed? In fact, the relation between the East India Company and the British government, which was acting at the behest of Crown, was a quid pro quo relation. Means East India Company was just the facade. From the beginning, they were being controlled remotely, and East India Company were paying this, an annual royalty to it. They were paying. Third, you can write that from Regulating Act 1773, more and more interference by the British Parliament in the functioning of East India Company. Their decisions, their political decisions in India was also controlled by the British Parliament. आप लिख सकते हैं, Pitt India Act 1784 established a board of control to govern the politico-military aspects in India. 1784. Agreed? So when you have to write whether the East India Company rule in India was planned or accidental, guys, you must write both the arguments. And how would we conclude? We would say that yes, initially it was not intended, but they explored and exploited the prevailing circumstances. And once they started, it was like a domino effect. One conquest led to the other. Agreed? Which was being navigated by the British Parliament from the beginning through the court of directors. तो आपका ये conclusion होगा that the British rule in India may have been accidental, but once it began with the conquest of Bengal, it was being navigated by the British Parliament through the Court of Directors and then the Board of Control and the Governor General. That's it, you have to write. समझ गए? Now the next question is very much related to this. That do you think that, or why the East India Company was able to prevail over, why was it able to prevail over the native states and the other European powers? Please tell me this. ये तो आपने समझ गया. Why the East India Company was able to prevail? Online students? Why it was able to prevail? Why it was able to prevail over the native states other European powers? दोनों कंबाइन कर दिया. Tell me. UPSC had asked a question few years back, I remember very categorically, that despite being more resourceful military wise, why was the East India Company able to win most of the wars from 1757 onwards? ये सवाल आया था ना. तो हमको क्या दिख रहा है इसमें बताइए. Why was the East India Company? One, I told you the argument and how the. अब बताइए this part. Yes, please.
Because of technological
superiority.
they had.
Okay, very good. Then
Also, they had the economic hunger to capture India because they were supported by the capitalists to back from the Europe.
so we did not have money.
We lacked unity.
Huh?
Our leaders lacked unity, or
अच्छा, we lacked unity.
that's why they are able to rule over.
Political fragmentation and no challenging power. One victory led to the other. अच्छा ठीक है. और बताइए.
Not dependent on British government for financial resources.
अच्छा.
Like France have funding from
Okay.
French government.
So they had systematic army instead of religion or caste-based.
Okay, tell me one thing, just one thing, and then we will come. When the British were fighting in India, East India Company Army, do you think that the East India Company Army consisted largely of Englishmen, or there were Indians also who were a part of it? So now the question again arises, why did Indians agree to be recruited by a foreign power and fight against their own rulers? आप समझ गए मेरा सवाल?
Regular payments were made.
Okay. Tell me. सोचिए सोचिए देखिए, this is a main session, and in a main session there will be questions out of anything, and you must learn to generate points and write. Yes, we will have a lot of fodder, but you must learn to generate points. घबराना नहीं है. Okay. Very good. Others also. So, East India Company versus the French Company. पहले तो ये समझ लीजिए, फिर इंडियंस के साथ देखेंगे. Why was the East India Company able to prevail over the French Company? I've written this. Why the East India Company was able to prevail over the. Yes.
Relative stability in British and France.
First of all, East India Company enjoyed considerable political autonomy. Considerable political autonomy. Yes, they were a chartered company, but the British Parliament did not interfere in their operations. This supported. Whereas the French company was state-owned, and hence there was more and more political interference, which hijacked and sabotaged their functioning. One of the blunders that they made is recall of Dupleix after the Carnatic War. After the first Carnatic War, recalling Dupleix was a mistake, whereas the East India Company allowed Clive to experiment with his political ideas. Now, the other reason is that Britain was more politically stable than France in 18th century. After the Glorious Revolution 1688, which ended absolutism and British Parliament became more active, they had a constitutional monarchy. This was also reflected in all the ventures that they had taken across the world. तो यहां पर देखिए आपका आंसर कितना अच्छा होता है. You are trying to locate the element of world history also because it is linked. Whereas France, the ancient regime in France, based on absolutism, based on interference of the nobility, I have taught in French Revolution, was not an efficient political system, and that was hurting this. Third aspect, the British Royal Navy was much more resourceful and advanced than the French Navy. So ये तीन लिखना है. Got it? One is the relation between them, and second is the navy. The second is the political system in Britain versus the political system in France, and third is the navy. Then East India Company over or versus the native states. East India Company versus the native states, very, very important. Number one, political disunity among Indian states means they were fighting amongst each other. They were against each other, so no united front. Against East India Company. Agreed? There are many examples. Mysore versus Marathas. Mysore versus the Nizam of Hyderabad. In fighting amongst the Marathas, you can write examples. हमेशा example एक जरूर दीजिए. History is incomplete without evidences. एक example जरूर दो. Second, East India Company officials' diplomacy very, very important. East India Company diplomacy means they were able to play one ruler against the other. Whereas Indian rulers were very weak in diplomacy. Can you give me an example? I'll tell you example. Following the Treaty of Salbai 1782, the East India Company was able to mobilize the support of Marathas against Tipu Sultan. That is an example. East India Company was able to procure the support of the Nizam of Hyderabad against both Marathas and Mysore whenever required. So these are examples. In the Third Anglo-Mysore War, Hyderabad and Marathas were on the East India Company side. Why? Because of the petty this. Third, अच्छा ये मिट गया. Third, lack of patriotism. Nationalism amongst Indians. This was missing. And this allowed the East India Company to employ Indian soldiers. I is Indian. They were driven by their parochial, their narrow, immediate commercial interests. Fourth, technological supremacy. of East India Company. आप लिख सकते हो except Hyder Ali and Mahatji Scindia, none of the Indian rulers focused on, and to some extent Maharaja Ranjit Singh focused on developing modern arsenal, modern means of organizing and regrouping the army. And fifth, guys, fifth aspect, the great firm theory. Very, very important. The great firm theory says that after the decline of Mughals in India, most of the prominent bankers and merchants, they shifted their allegiance to the East India Company than the native states. They lost faith. It was because of the economic support funding. The East India Company was able to raise funding very easily, because to fight these wars, you need a lot of money. And why they did it? Because one, no patriotism, nationalism was there, and they had a belief. They were aware that East India Company is doing global trade, so they have a greater chance of paying the interest on time, and that also higher interest. Agreed? It has happened. So if you write these 4 points, you can substantiate in a very argumentative, logical manner that why East India Company, why the British were able to prevail, even if in many cases the native states army was numerically superior. The technique of fighting, all of this, ये सब आप बाकी लिख सकते हैं, ठीक है? So establishment of British rule in India, I had to tell you these 2 things. Keep it in mind, and this will help you whenever you have to answer anything. Pick up these themes. ये keywords लिखिए, underline कीजिए, give the quotations. Agreed? Now moving to the British rule, as I said, we'll start with the economic theme. चलिए, we have created our team. We all sat together and to discuss that which are the areas from where it is uploaded on the portal. आपने देखिए, from where we can expect more number of questions, है ना? उसमें अब देखिए, over the last few years they have been asking more questions from the economic aspect of British rule in India. They can ask on agriculture, drain of wealth, they can ask. They have asked on deindustrialization. Agreed? So this aspect is very, very important. The economic aspect of British rule in India, which I call as the economic imperialism of the British Raj. Economic imperialism. How the British looted us, what were the various ways, and what was the impact of that on Indian politics, Indian society, Indian economy, obviously. Now, when we talk about the economic imperialism of the British rule in India, I would want you to mention some references, which you can call as evidences. It can be either a quotation or it can be an important work on this. Which are the important works which you must remember? एक है R.C. Dutt, who was a former civil servant. उनकी किताब है The Economic History of India, which is mentioned in your NCERT also. Second is, which made a lot of news in the last few years when it had come published, following that Oxford debate by Shashi Tharoor, and the book is Era of Darkness. So I'll be quoting Era of Darkness more and more. It looks good. Why not to quote an authentic book? Then Karl Marx, even the Marxists, they have also referred to. Karl Marx had written a series of articles, I think I mentioned here, dekhiye, a series of articles in New York Daily Tribune, in which he analyzed the economic adverse impact of British rule on Indian handicrafts and handlooms and also on Indian agriculture. He had written a series of essays. एक essay तो बहुत ही famous है, Asiatic mode of production, in which he has also spoken about the nature of agriculture in the Oriental world. वो अलग बात है. Then there are books by, or there are works by moderates also. Then there is a Marxist who is R.P. Dutt, जिन्होंने किताब लिखी India Today. So I would want you to remember some of these names, their works, and use them in your introductions or wherever you have to substantiate your arguments. Agreed? Now, when we talk about the economic imperialism of the British rule, the British economic exploitation of the British in India, we would always start with a quotation. A quotation which was something which was very famous line, which was given by John Sullivan, who was the president of Board of Revenue of Madras. इन्होंने देखिए क्या कहते हैं. He says that our system acts very much like a sponge, drawing up all the good things from the banks of river Ganges, मतलब इंडिया से हम ले रहे हैं, and squeezing it down the river of Thames. मतलब यहां से he is saying, means even the British, they are acknowledging, but they are not saying in open, or they are saying that in return of this money that we are taking from you, we are providing you numerous very valuable service. ये अलग बात है. Then even R.C. Dutt has written that the moisture which fertilized from the Indian soil, it fell as a rain on the English soil. बात वही है. Now, when we talk about the economic exploitation of India, I would want you to, what are the various ways in which they exploited us? Tell me. What are the various ways, or what are the various aspects of economic imperialism? Question पूछते हैं ना इस पे, बताइए. Okay, home charges. और customs. Okay. Then बताइए, if you are asked, throw light on the economic aspect of British rule in India, तो क्या लिखिएगा? Loans interest.
The raw materials and give the finished products.
हाँ, है ना? So before we discuss, आप देखिए कुछ themes मैं कराऊंगा आपको, I'll discuss. But when we talk about the economic imperialism, the economic exploitation of the British in India, R.P. Dutt, there are so many works in his book India Today. He's a Marxist. And R.P. Dutt in his book India Today has said that when we analyze the British economic exploitation, then guys, we find there are various phases. And he has given 3 phases of exploitation. So you must remember the 3 phases. First is 1757 to 1813. This is the phase of mercantilistic drain. (1757) Battle of Plassey, conquest of Bengal, to 1813 Charter Act 1813. This was a period where we see East India Company used their political authority to establish trade monopoly. Agreed? Trade monopoly. So the nature of trade was dictated trade. But gradually we see this monopoly of East India Company was protested even in England by the industrialists. And then Industrial Revolution came, because of which industrialists wanted to procure raw materials without paying commission to the East India Company and to sell it freely. Also because of Napoleon's continental wars, the English industrialists were facing losses to some extent, because Napoleon tried to prevent the trade between Britain and all the European powers under his control, continental system. So therefore, we see that gradually the monopoly of East India Company will be taken away, and hence mercantilism will end. So the phase from 1813 to 1870s is the idea of free trade capitalism. And we see that this was a period of industrial capitalism. Industrial Britain exploited India. So India was gradually being converted. Yes, opium trade will come in this only, obviously. Opium yahi pe to aayega na. In fact, you read that one of the reasons why the British would also exercise political authority because they wanted to save bullion. Why was opium cultivated in Bengal? Because they wanted to exchange this opium for buying the Chinese goods and save their gold and silver. Ye bhi hai. This is what is mercantilism. So during this phase, we find that India, which used to be a prominent power, trading power and also manufacturing hub, was gradually getting deindustrialized. Hum padhenge, deindustrialization began. This is the phase of deindustrialization on a large scale. And not only that, they also promoted the English capitalists to set up plantations in India. We find that Assam wasteland rules gave 3,000 acre of land tax free. 3,000 acre of land tax free so that they can establish plantations, tea plantations, coffee plantations. तो इस तरह से exploitation चल रहा था. And then 1870s we see finance capitalism. Not only they were procuring raw materials and selling their industrial goods, from 1870s more so, the excess accumulated capital in England was diverted towards India, export of capital towards development of railways. You'll read guarantee system. The British government borrowed heavily from them. They could have borrowed from India. So one of the aspects of home charges is the high debt that the British government in India was accumulating and the interest that was paid on the debt to whom? Them. So when you look at the British economic imperialism, before we go to what are the different dimensions in which economic imperialism happened, first of all, there are different phases. And then as I said, when you talk about economic imperialism, तो इसमें भी बहुत कुछ है. There is agriculture. Agriculture में we see the land revenue system. Agreed. Then there is commercialization of agriculture. We have to discuss commercialization of agriculture. Then we see deindustrialization. We have to understand that how it was a paradox that on one hand England was industrializing, India was deindustrializing. Or was it deindustrializing? That is also a question. Third, we see dictated trade. The nature of trade was not free trade. Even after the monopoly of East India Company was abolished, the trade was never a free trade. It was free trade for them. Indian traders continued to face a lot of obstacles, impediments, discriminatory policies were there. Fourth, home charges. Home charges includes one, the administrative costs. Home charges include the interest. ये मैं आपको बता रहा हूं, बस आपको मालूम है. And then the other way by which was council of bills. This was very interesting aspect. Council of bills. What is the council of bill? I'll let you know. Any capitalist in Britain has to do trade in India or has to do an economic operation. So in India, for example, the Indian currency is rupee, but he has pound. So what that person will do, that person will deposit with the British bank or to the British government that equivalent amount of pound, say 5,000 pound, and it will be converted to Indian rupee, and that money he should get in India so that he can do the trade and whatever aspects. But the interesting aspect is that in many cases, so once you have given the money and you get a council of bill कि आप जाके इंडिया में दिखाओ, आपको British banks or British government will give you. But what happened in many cases that the British government kept that money with themselves and they expected the British India government to furnish the money. मतलब वो पैसा यहां से कभी नहीं आता था, तो ये डिफरेंस गया. Council of Bills was also a way. So you must understand that these are the many ways by which we find that British were exploiting us economically, and this economic imperialism was the basis of economic critique. By whom? Moderates. यही है ना जी. This was the economic critique. And this economic critique by moderates contributed to economic nationalism. Moderates were moderate in their political domain, but they were very critical of the British rule in terms of the economic aspect. It is the moderates who gave an estimate of this loss. In what way? How did the moderates estimated this economic imperialism? Two ways. One is drain of wealth and second is balance sheet debate. समझिए इस बात को. How did they provide the estimate? One is drain of wealth. पढ़ते हैं ना आप लोग? Drain of wealth was actually an economic estimation of how the money, in what ways the money was flowing, and whether we were getting concomitant services in return for that. Drain of wealth, it is an estimation. They first figure out how the money is flowing in what ways, and then they started coming up with the numbers. And what is the balance sheet debate? बताइए, have you heard of it? I'll tell you. The balance sheet debate actually exposes that India was importing more finished goods and exporting more capital. We were exporting capital. पैसा नेट बाहर जा रहा था देश से. Export of capital. And the return was very less. This is the balance sheet debate. पैसा निकल रहा था. So in this line we have to understand about few things. One is deindustrialization. यहां से शुरू करते हैं. We have to understand about deindustrialization. समझ गए? I'll not be able to cover all the topics of economic imperialism, but the important ones. पहला है deindustrialization. यूपीएससी ने 2 साल पहले एक सवाल पूछा. That do you think that the decline of handicrafts and handlooms in India was due to industrial revolution in England? That was the question asked in GS paper 1. That do you think that IR in England and deindustrialization in India were linked? What do you think? सवाल यही पूछा था ना. To what extent the decline of handicrafts and handloom sector in India was due to industrial revolution in England? बताइए.
Because
ठीक.
So the costly handicrafts were less in demand.
Okay, then सबसे पहले तो क्वेश्चन को पकड़ो. When the question itself is saying to what extent, इसका मतलब है that deindustrialization in India was not just because of industrial revolution, there are other aspects. To what extent जब कह दिया, and even if it was not mentioned to what extent, आप जैसे ही पढ़ेंगे आपको समझ में आ जाएगा that there are, yes, English industrialization was a factor, but then there are other factors also. So deindustrialization. And for deindustrialization, you can just understand one thing, very, very interesting. Shashi Tharoor का एक estimate है, आप लिख लीजिए. Shashi Tharoor in his era of darkness, online students, you must also respond. Shashi Tharoor in his era of darkness, now what does he say? He says how the nature of Indian economy changed with the establishment of British rule, how India, which was a net exporter of commodities, has now become an underdeveloped. So Shashi Tharoor कहते हैं that India's share in global trade in 1707 was 23.25%, means around a quarter. It was 23.25%, which declined to less than 3% in 1947. Declined to less than 3%. So means before the British established their political rule, you can clearly see India was resource rich and it dominated the world economy. R.C. Dutt has written that deindustrialization and drain of wealth, they are linked. Drain of wealth was responsible for the underdevelopment of Indian industries because there was outflow of capital. And that is why we did not have sufficient capital to invest. And then also those who had, British discouraged them in any capacity. Now, when we have to write on this deindustrialization, what is the interpretation of deindustrialization? Deindustrialization simply refers to the decline of traditional handicrafts and handloom industries in India and the decline of population engaged in the manufacturing sector. Although we did not have modern industries, but still India was a net producer and exporter of a number of goods. Textile to thai. So India was also witnessing proto-industrialization alongside a number of European powers. India में भी दादनी system चल रहा था. But then all of this changed. And the deindustrialization, how was it measured? In terms of the population shift that was happening. Generally, what happens that as an economy grows, more and more population moves from agriculture to industries, industries to services. That is what happened in England also following the agricultural revolution. But India में उल्टा चल रहा है. That is why I have mentioned a study by Colin Clark. This is a data. You must, wherever possible, come up with data. Colin Clark is again an Englishman, economist who has given a study that how the population engaged in manufacturing and mining used to be 34-35% in 1881, and this has declined to almost half by 1911. This is a study. This is a study you can quote. There are more studies, but आप एक याद रखिए, आपको ज़्यादा नहीं याद रखना. Now the next question is why deindustrialization happened? Because I told you that when you look at the factors responsible for deindustrialization, it is both because of industrial evolution and other factors also. So if I start answering why deindustrialization happened, one was political impact of the decline of Maharajas and Nawabs. That is why we have mentioned loss of official patronage. This has nothing to do. Loss of official patronage, देखिए. Loss of official patronage means that these Maharajas and Nawabs who used to be who give a lot of funding, they used to procure, they used to be the clientele, that clientele has lost. Ye chala gaya. It's a political aspect. Second, the middle class that was emerging, the aristocratic elites, zamindars, educated middle class, they were more fond of industrial goods. Why? For them, it was a sign of embracing modernity. They were modernist in their outlook. And obviously, these goods were cheaper and of decent quality. And seeing them, देखिए मैंने यहाँ पे third point लिखा है, Sanskritization trend was also happening in certain parts of India. Seeing these upper caste, educated elites, middle class, buying industrial goods in many regions, even the lower caste and class started buying them. For example, in South India, आप example जरूर लिखिए, the declining sales of handmade Kanjivaram sari, silk. Women also preferred to. They also wanted to embrace modernity, and the lower caste also, this thing is there. So when you write these 2-3 points, you can clearly dissociate deindustrialization only from industrial revolution. That is what is expected. तो आपको यहाँ कीवर्ड लिखना होगा Sanskritization, loss of official patronage, embracing modernity, and then obviously there are British deliberately also adopted policies to carry out deindustrialization. It was not a fair competition between Indian handicrafts and handloom. It was not a fair competition. Even Karl Marx has written in his essays in New York Tribune that not a single cascade of raw material from India reached the English industries without having a stain of blood of an Indian weaver. मतलब ऐसा नहीं कि लोगों को मार रहे थे, but actually it means that you are killing the livelihood of so many. Killing the livelihood of so many. British discriminatory tariff policy. British discriminatory tariff policy. In fact, I want you to remember and write somewhere the evidence that as early as 1769, बात की बात छोड़िए, as early as 1769, the Court of Directors, you have to write also. The Court of Directors discouraged the export of Bengal textile and encouraged the raw materials. Discouraged the export of Bengal textiles, finished goods. So they wanted then only to convert Bengal into an agricultural farm. Discriminatory policies. And on one hand, they are creating obstacles. They are putting high tariff on the inflow of Indian textile goods. On the other hand, the British goods found it very easier to enter the market. Later, when the railways were introduced, the railways also charged different freight charges for transporting. So yes, you can say this. There was a deliberate policy. इसलिए मैं आपको example लिखा हूँ. Court of Directors 1769. It is an example. And in some cases, they even started physical destruction of handlooms. कई जगहों पे ऐसा हुआ है that in Bengal region, Bengal, Bihar, Odisha, that the prices that East India Company would pay for the raw textile was so less that the farmers, the weavers would go into losses, so they would cut their thumb कि हम कह देंगे कि हमसे बना नहीं जाएगा. So these are the factors because of which deindustrialization happened. Now, what are the negative and the positive impact of deindustrialization? ये आप बताएंगे. That is what I have left it for you. What are the negative and the positive aspects of deindustrialization? Tell me the negative. हाँ, तो पहला लिखेंगे decline of traditional textile hubs like Dhaka, Murshidabad. Decline of traditional hubs. So a number of urban centers started declining. Surat also declined, only to be revived later. Next phenomena is called as re-ruralization. There was reverse migration. Many artisans who lost their livelihood now had to fall back upon agriculture. They had to fall back upon agriculture. And because of this, we see that there was fragmentation of land holding, जो आप कह रहे हैं. Because earlier in a family, if there are two persons who are doing agriculture, then two others will be linked with handicrafts. अब सब वापस आ गए. And because of fragmentation of land holding, we see agricultural productivity will decline because investment will decline. It also affected the self-sufficiency of village economy. Self-sufficiency. What are some of the positive impact of deindustrialization? Can you tell me? Positive impact of deindustrialization. Okay. Then increased labor productivity due to technological specialization. So gradually when industries will come, people realize that we will not be able to compete with our traditional mode of production. And gradually when industries will be set up in India, labor productivity will be better, specialization. But yes, massive unemployment also happened. Second, the availability of domestic goods and foreign goods. It created an extensive market and more choices, as you already said. It created an extensive market and more choices. Then third is rise of new labor class, which will give rise to trade unionism, labor organizations. Agreed? Deindustrialization is this. This is something that you can write on deindustrialization. Next is commercialization of agriculture. Very important topic. What do you mean by commercialization of agriculture? अब देखिए इसमें क्या है, especially from second half of 19th century, driven by a number of factors, we see that there was a shift in the nature of cropping pattern in certain areas. We see that there was a shift where there was more emphasis on crash crops. Organization of agriculture was driven primarily by commercial interest, not by the interest of food security. Objective. Means if I have to say in layman language, it has to be more crash crops in certain regions like jute, cotton, indigo, plantations. But one thing you have to notice is that unlike Europe, where commercialization of agriculture was both commercialization of input and output, in India there was only commercialization of output, no commercialization of input. इसमें अंतर क्या है? You have to write this somewhere. That in Europe, we see agricultural revolution in England and other changes where commercialization of input means where they even invested in their agricultural technology. They brought in new agricultural tools. Agriculture became more and more productive. Here ऐसा नहीं था. Here they were just driven by outcome, not by improving the nature of Indian agriculture. There was no emphasis made on research and development, on training of farmers. Intensive farming continued. And in some regions we find that there was more emphasis put by the British or encouragement to the peasants to grow cash crops. Now, let me tell you that To some extent, the commercialization of agriculture was encouraged, but it was also voluntarily embraced by the Indian farmers. It was not forced. In some areas, it was forced, like Teen Kathia system was forced. But cotton cultivation in Maharashtra was voluntary because of the higher prices that they were getting. Now, the question is, why commercialization of agriculture started in India? Tell me. Commercialization of agriculture in India was very much linked with the British economic interest and was also an outcome of a number of international factors. समझिए. When you write why commercialization of agriculture started, why suddenly in many parts of India we see growth of or cultivation of cash crops, so we have to write that one, it was driven by the needs of industrializing Britain. Second, it was also a compulsion, अभी मैं बता दूंगा, लिखा भी है, a compulsion of international developments. Commercialization of agriculture in India was also facilitated by the British land revenue policies. Because to grow cash crops, you needed seeds, you needed a lot of investment, so cash economy was required. Earlier, in the Jajmani system, the type of barter system or service-based economy, commercialization of agriculture नहीं हो सकता था. That is why you see that because of when commercialization of agriculture started, the need for cash allowed for the entry of sahukars and money lenders. That increased the debt trap. ये भी आप पढ़ते हैं, नहीं? So now the question if arises that what are the factors which led to commercialization of agriculture? तो आप कहोगे सबसे पहले कि सर commercialization of agriculture was facilitated by the British land revenue policies leading to the growth of cash economy in villages. Second, you will say that commercialization of agriculture was facilitated by the growth of modern transport and communication system. But then you will say that it is not just the factor. Commercialization of agriculture was because as England was industrializing, there was need for more and more raw materials, especially cotton. Then you write that commercialization of agriculture was also based on or driven by a number of international developments. आप लिखते हो American Civil War. Because of or during the American Civil War, because of British-American Civil War, the supply of American cotton to Britain reduced, because of which they encouraged the cultivation of cotton in the Maharashtra Deccan Belt. पहला. दूसरा आप लिखोगे that the French Revolution 1789 to 99 disrupted the supply of indigo from France, which forced the British to promote indigo cultivation in various parts of North India. बाद में with the arrival of synthetic dyes ये खत्म. तो second is this. Third, you will write the Taiping Rebellion in China 1850 to 64 against the Manchu dynasty. मैंने लिख रखा है यहाँ पे. Affected tea supplies, so they started encouraging more and more tea plantations in India. फिर आप पढ़ोगे Crimean War 1853-56. Russia was a major supplier of jute and that disrupted, so they started encouraging jute cultivation in eastern Bengal. फिर आप कहोगे opium cultivation in Bengal was driven by British bullionism with respect to China. So these are the points which you must write, which will give a reflection that you are relating what is happening in India with what is happening in across the world. समझ रहे हैं? Then your answer becomes very good. सिर्फ आप एक पॉइंट नहीं लिख सकते कि इंडस्ट्रियल रेवोल्यूशन के कारण हुआ. You have to link it with the land revenue policy. You have to link it with the growth of transport and communication. You have to link it with what is happening in America, France, Russia, China, wherever possible. फिर आप लिखोगे that commercialization of agriculture was accelerated after the opening of the Suez Canal because that facilitated more and more. Got it, guys? That facilitated more and more. So this is how your answer will look like a complete dimension. मैंने आपको कहा ना, you must write more and more dimensions. Now, guys, moving to the impact of commercialization of agriculture. This PPT will be available on the portal, I think. Is it available? अच्छा नहीं दिख रहा है, आई विल टेल दिस वाज, इसीलिए तो बनाया, नहीं तो फिर क्यों करते? तो अगर मेरे को था तो मैं तो ब्लैंक बोर्ड पे पढ़ा था, टेबुला रूसा नहीं. So this will be available, don't worry. And not only this, for every section in a similar format, बस आप ये करना that you download it or in some capacity, and then whatever extra thing, most of the things मैंने इसलिए लिख दिया ताकि मेरे को भी लिखना ना पड़े और आपके भी इन शॉर्ट, कल भी क्लास है तो डाउनलोड एंड कीप इट, इट इज देयर, आई विल टेल देम. पीपीटी नहीं, ये पीडीएफ है, सॉरी.
अगर ये क्लास से पहले मिल जाते हैं ना तो हम इसमें ही साइड में.
हाँ हाँ, ये क्लास से पहले मिल जाएगी. I will request. This was the first class, so apologies. But ये क्लास से पहले ही मिल जाएगा. It will get uploaded before the class. ये मॉडर्न इंडिया का तो आज ही हो जाएगा. On Wednesday I have art and culture and ancient India. That will also be uploaded. Agreed. So that yes, इसी में in this only, and I will try to request, and they will do it. We all are working in this capacity only. Don't worry, online students also will do it. ठीक है, इसके लिए तो है ही, ठीक है, नो वरीज. अभी इस पर ध्यान दीजिए, कोई बात नहीं है ना. इम्पैक्ट क्या है इसका? व्हाट इज द इम्पैक्ट ऑफ कॉमर्शियलाइजेशन? कॉमर्शियलाइजेशन ऑफ एग्रीकल्चर, टू व्हाट एक्सटेंट अफेक्टेड फूड सिक्योरिटी इज अ डिबेटेबल इशू. ये बहुत ही डिबेटेबल इशू है. That was commercialization of agriculture responsible for the recurring famine, yes or no? Because the common impression is that with commercialization of agriculture, food security was compromised, because on a lot of fertile land, food crops ki jagah cash crop, because it was more profitable for this. But let me tell you that you have to say that a good person or a well-read person will never write this straightforward. They will write that yes, commercialization of agriculture has made a dent on food security, but not directly. Because let me tell you, it is an evidence that even at the time of independence, 80% of cultivable land was diverted towards or was used for food crops. The problem is because of commercialization of agriculture, because there is a lot of vulnerability of the peasants. Sometimes you will make a lot of profit, sometimes you will not be. So a person or a farmer who is very much dependent upon a cash crop, if he suffers losses, so you have put your entire field for cash crop, then your subsistence base will be weakened. आप समझ रहे हैं इस बात को? तो अच्छा आंसर कैसे लिखा जाएगा? You will not just write this point and move ahead. You will say that commercialization of agriculture did not contribute to famine directly. Why? Because 80% of the agricultural land at the time of independence consisted of food crops. But by increasing their vulnerability to the market, the subsistence base was narrowed. आप समझ रहे हैं? मैं ही एक फार्मर and I grow only cotton, और किसी साल बहुत नुकसान हो गया तो मेरे तो खाने की भी हालत हो जाएगी खराब. Because earlier, if I would grow some food crop, तो कम से कम खाने का तो रहेगा. So that is why we'll see. Second aspect of commercialization of agriculture, I have written both the aspects यहाँ पे, is that commercialization of agriculture and deindustrialization are interlinked. Because the cash crops which were grown here were not for the Indian handicrafts and handloom, but for the British. So with commercialization of agriculture, the traditional relation, the organic relation between Indian manufacturing sector and Indian agriculture was broken. Do you get it? Third, commercialization of agriculture resulted in regionalization of agriculture. Regionalization of agriculture means certain crops were grown in particular area, like wheat cultivation in Punjab, cotton cultivation in Maharashtra, jute cultivation in East Bengal. Regionalization. Commercialization of agriculture also has an ecological dimension, जो कि आप लिख सकते हैं. Ecological dimension means adversely affected the soil fertility. That is why you see the Champaran Satyagraha Commercialization of agriculture exposed the Indian peasants to the volatility of the global market. Seesaw होता था. There was a lot of uncertainty with respect to agricultural income. Can you give me an example? Prices of cotton during the American Civil War. When the American Civil War was going on, the price of Indian cotton was high. But after the end of American Civil War, the prices crashed. Commercialization of agriculture led to increased rural indebtedness. They became more and more vulnerable to money lenders and sahukar. पढ़ सकते. Commercialization of agriculture in India did not result in technological changes in agriculture. Agriculture remained like same. इसलिए मैंने आपको क्या बताया था? Commercialization of output, not input. What are some of the positive impacts of commercialization of agriculture? एक लाइन जरूर लिख लीजिए, अगर नहीं लिखा है तो. What are some of the, we are writing a positive impact, negative impact. आप लिखिए मुंशी प्रेमचंद in Godan. Very famous. Munshi Premchand in Godan has mentioned that commercialization of agriculture has led to proletarianization of Indian peasants. Proletarianization of Indian peasants. इसका क्या अर्थ है? Proletarianization of Indian peasants बड़ा इंटरेस्टिंग है. Yes, I told you, because of this volatility, because of this debt trap of the money lenders, many of the cultivator owners lost everything and they became agricultural laborers. Very good. गोदान में कहानी है. अब आप सोचिए, आप लिख रहे हैं हिस्ट्री, बट आप यहां मुंशी प्रेमचंद का गोदान ले आ रहे हैं. This is what we have to do in our mains examination. That we will be writing multi-dimensional and facts from diverse areas to substantiate. Agreed? यही तो आपको लिखना है. Now, what are the positive impacts of commercialization of agriculture? बताइए. What are the positive impacts? कुछ तो positive होगा. First, commercialization of agriculture improved the agricultural knowledge or know-how of peasants. They began to understand that, okay, our soil is more conducive for it. Later, driven by the needs of commercialization of agriculture, British had to set up agricultural colleges and universities in India, especially in the time of whom? Lord Curzon. Because they wanted to exploit and know more about it. मैंने एक theme आपको पढ़ाना है, development of science and technology during British Raj. It is a theme. Agricultural Research Institute started coming up because they wanted to understand the soil profile. Second, commercialization of agriculture led to the organization of Indian agriculture along capitalist lines. More and more inflow of money, although it was exploitative, but it provided the future model for development of Indian agriculture. Second, commercialization of agriculture, it increased the geographical isolation of Indian villages and they began to be connected on a larger level. And because of this, the problems that they were facing were no longer regional, but over a period of time it became national issues. You know, nationalization of the peasant issues. That is why you read peasant movements, because it was no longer, yes, cash economy, integrated all India market, ये सारी चीजें हो रही. What is the good aspects? That in the regions where cash crops were grown more and problems, later these issues became the hotbeds of peasant movements and the integration of peasants into national politics. अब पढ़ते हैं that a number of regional association and later Congress integrated the peasant issues with the national issues. Which are some of the regional associations? Can you tell me? मैं आपको एग्जाम्पल देता हूं. पूना सार्वजनिक सभा ऑफ महादेव गोविंद राणा डे. Pune Sarvajanik Sabha of Mahadev Govind Rana Day was associated with which peasant movement? You will write Deccan agricultural riots. So commercialization of agriculture was bad, but good also. So there is an ecological angle. And then what was the social impact of commercialization of agriculture? Social impact बताइए. Social impact तो ये है that commercialization of agriculture benefited the rich landlords and the rich peasants. Agricultural tenancy and गोदान पढ़ा ना, proletarianization of Indian peasants. Then we see, because of commercialization of agriculture, a new section becomes influential in the village: money lenders and sahukar. Unholy nexus was there. Then you see a number of peasant movements: Indigo Revolt 1859-60, Deccan agricultural riots 1870s, agreed? Champaran Satyagraha. These are prominent movements associated with commercialization of agriculture. ठीक है? Let's move to the other aspect. Okay, this is very important. Generally, people tend to miss out on this. Famines during British Raj. Famines during British Raj. This will be uploaded. Students, don't worry. Please do not worry. अभी आप इस पर ध्यान दीजिए. And the team is saying you upload हो चुका है ना ये. It is uploaded. Please go and check because yesterday only I shared it. और वैसे भी आप देखिए most of the चीजें तो लिखी हैं, जो नहीं लिखी हैं I'm telling you आप बस लिख लो साइड में, and when you get the note you add it there. आज भर की थोड़ी दिक्कत है. Famine policy. First we have some data, because what type of questions can be expected? What is the famine policy? Why famines happened? Agreed. What was the British response to this? You can get question. Now when we talk about the famines during British rule, we will divide it in two phases. One is the Crown's rule later after 1857, and the other is the East India Company rule. Now in the time of East India Company, there were 12 famine and 4 severe scarcities. Now what is interesting, or what is to be noted, is that famines in India were not just because of natural disasters or ecological stress. To some extent, British policies, economic policies, administrative apathy is responsible for that. तो अगर आपसे पूछा जाए कि why famines were happening, हम देख लेते हैं इस पे, but why there were so many famines? So you have to understand that famines in India was not just an outcome of natural disasters, but these natural disasters or these ecological stress were amplified by the British policies, administrative indifference, by commercialization of agriculture in a way. And then Amartya Sen has written a very interesting aspect when he writes on the Bengal famine 1943. Amartya Sen कहते हैं entitlement issue. So when you write about the Bengal famine, बहुत से famines के example है. You must know few of them. Agreed? And for preparing this topic, you have to remember the name of some of the commissions and their landmark important recommendations. But सबसे पहले क्या important है आपके लिए जानना? Why? So famines in India were not enough. What is famine? Famine means, what is famine? आप समझ रहे हैं ना famine? Inadequate food. So famine is not because of drought. Yes, drought was there, but it could have been handled better. So that is what I have written, that famines in India were episodes of natural disasters, ecological stress, which was amplified by the British revenue policies, एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव इंडिफरेंस और इनकम्पिटेंस, दोनों बात है. जैसे ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी के समय तो इंडिफरेंस था, उनको फर्क ही नहीं पड़ा था, देयर वाज नो पॉलिसी, एंड लेटर इट वाज इनकम्पिटेंस. एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव इंडिफरेंस एंड इनकम्पिटेंस. फिर क्या लिखा है? रिजिड रेवेन्यू डिमांड्स. इवन इन एपिसोड्स ऑफ crop failure, the British were very adamant with respect to collection of their land revenue. Agreed? Then commercialization of agriculture. मैंने आपको ये लिखा, commercialization of agriculture is not directly related but indirectly. How? Because commercialization of agriculture मैंने देखिए यहाँ लिख दिया है, increased market dependence and lowered the, इसका arrow का मतलब है lowered, increased का up arrow. ये मैंने shortcut के लिए किया, एग्जाम में मत करना है. The subsistence base. And then entitlement issue was given by whom? Dr. Amartya Sen, who has written that why famines occurred is because it was a governance failure. People were unable to fetch the available food which was in the market. Either the pricing was high or hoarding was happening, or there was no rights based. No rights based. Now coming to, before we move to the policies, कुछ चीजें देख लेते हैं. Data, जैसे I said that when we look at the British, the famine during the British Raj, there were 12 during the Crown's rule. I have mentioned the name of some of the significant ones. एक दो के नाम याद रख लो. Like the Bengal famine 1770, 1/3 of the population died. The Guntur famine 1833, 2 lakh population out of 5 lakh. Can you imagine? 40% died. Odisha famine, इसके बाद then during the Crown's rule also we had Odisha famine 1866. मैं आपको पढ़ाऊंगा how because of the Odisha famine a language issue emerged. Odisha भाषा आंदोलन, वहां से शुरुआत होती है, language politics in India, beginning of that in post independence. Then the great famine of 1876-78, which affected various parts of India, Mysore, Hyderabad, Karnataka, Awadh, Central Province, many provinces. And this happened when Lytton was the Governor General. And amidst this famine, when people were dying all over India, R.C. Dutt has given an estimate of 5 million deaths. 5 million लोग मरे थे and 53 million people were affected adversely. आप समझ लिए 5 करोड़ लोग उस समय. And amidst this chaos and human suffering, Mr. Lytton has a priority to organize the first Delhi Darbar, जिसको लेके बहुत हंगामा हुआ था. His policies were criticized by Amrit Bazar Patrika. You are aware of that. Vernacular Press Act, all of this has come. And then obviously the Bengal famine of 1943. Now Bengal famine of 1943 UPSC के लिए बड़ा जरूरी है. Bengal famine of 1943 happened, one, because the Japanese cut off the supply of rice that was coming from Burma. Second, wartime disruption, trade and commerce. Third, diversion of whatever food was there to the war front. And who was the British Prime Minister? Mr. Churchill. And Churchill was in a denial mode. He said, let the people die. Hoarding was happening. इसलिए इसको लेके बहुत हंगामा हुआ है. That is why Dr. Amartya Sen has written that people died in Bengal not because of inadequate food, but because of the lack of entitlement, or they could not demand it from the government, which at its will was diverting it. Quit India movement चल रहा था, Second World War. People were dying. Bengal famine बहुत बार सुना होगा. And that is why Churchill का एक बड़ा infamous statement है that Gandhiji was on a hunger strike against the violence and sufferings, he asked, everybody is dying, why not Gandhi? He had planned a funeral also. He let Gandhi die and the problem will be solved. But then Gandhiji flummoxed them. हम पढ़ेंगे अभी गांधी. He's a mystique, बेरूपिया. गांधी जी ने अपना हंगर स्ट्राइक खत्म कर दिया. बोला नहीं मरेंगे. So these are some of the famines you must, few of them you must remember. The Great Famine, agreed. अब बात करते हैं what was the British famine policy. Did they have a policy? They had to, especially in the time of Crown rule. So in the time of East India Company, there was no policy. East India Company was just indifferent, nonchalant to the sufferings of the masses. They were primarily concerned with the maximization of their revenue. Primarily. Now, however, with the establishment of the Crown, when the British comes forward, when they say that yes, we have taken over, they cannot be that indifferent because it will lead to a lot of bad name. For the first time, if you look at the British attempt, the first attempt which was made towards this issue was in 1860-61 when Baird-Smith Committee, which decided to investigate into the causes of the famine, but it did not make any relief-based recommendation. उसने बस investigate किया. So still it looked like a charity that the Britishers were doing. The second, which comes in the 1866, where this, for the first time, the George Campbell Committee shifted the responsibility on the government, that it is not charity, it is your responsibility. Government is responsible for famine relief, and we must construct railways and canals for speedy disposal and distribution of subsidized food and grain. And they also put the onus on the district officers to prevent famine-related death. So first time we see this. In the backdrop of the great famine that happened, and then the Delhi Darbar, then the criticism that was happening of Lytton, the British realized that we must come up with a comprehensive policy, famine policy. तो आप किसी चीज को याद करो ना करो, आप ये स्ट्रैशी कमीशन जरूर याद रखना. Even if in the examination मान लीजिए आप सब भूल गए, but at least remember the Strachey Commission. Why? Because this Strachey Commission, it was responsible for, or its recommendation provided for the drafting of Famine Code 1883. Now the Famine Code 1883 listed that the famine prevention should be based on 4 parameters. उसके 4 pillars थे, लिख लीजिए. Prevention, early warning, relief measures, and famine mapping. Prevention, early warnings, relief measures, and famine mapping. Then it also recommended that we must have a dedicated fund to provide relief whenever people require. We must focus on relief work. We must collect agricultural data. In case of occurring of famine, we must let go of land revenue demand. So this was a first comprehensive policy where we see that the British are taking onus. They are actually trying to help people. That is what I am saying, the Strachey Commission. Iske baad, then you can also talk about the MacDonald Commission, which recommended that there must be not the district officers, but there must be dedicated commissioners who should be responsible for the famine mapping, for relief, all these aspects. It also talks about establishing agricultural banks, that in case of famines, the impoverished farmers must be given subsidized loans. It also talks about expansion of irrigation, so that the dependency on natural rain should reduce. It also talks about better transport. तो ये बातें ये कह रहा है. And then in the backdrop of the Bengal famine, when lot of criticism started happening not only in India but also in England, the British apathy, then the Woodhead Commission 1943, which talks about creating an All India Council, जिसमें बाद में आप देखिए the Food Corporation of India is based on the works of All India Food Council, है ना? Food Corporation of India. Then it says that we must have an integrated All India Food Administration. So what I want you to remember is that the British famine policy was initially a policy of denial, but from there they started acknowledging. Then their policy was reactive to proactive, and then we see that they have, over the period of time when so many people have died. But let me tell you an estimate which is given even by many historians. Even Bipan Chandra writes that during the British Raj, around 2 to 3 crore people died due to famine. 20 million people have died approximately due to famine, and it was because of man-made causes. This explains that कभी भी आपको वो सवाल आएगा जब आप नोबल सिविलाइजिंग मिशन की बात करेंगे, then you bring this demographic cost also. The British rule in India, apart from the people who died because of war, violence, there were people who died because of lack of food. Demographic cost of British rule in India. So, guys, the famine policy is this. Now, moving to from the famine policy, let's move to the railways. Very, very important. Railways in India can be called as imperialism on wheels. British imperialism now acquired a new shape or new way of exploiting. Imperialism on wheels. Now, the British railway policy in India was driven by their interest. There was no emphasis, or they did not think of Indian interest, or there was no genuine attempt to bring the benefits of Western technology, Western civilization to India. But over the period of time, we see that the railways have played a very important role in our socio-political domain. हम अभी देखेंगे railways का impact. British brought railways in India. Why? Because through railways, they created an avenue for investment for the British capitalists. हमने पढ़ा है finance capitalism. Railways in India was an example of finance capitalism because many people in England, many industrialists had surplus accumulated wealth, and they needed avenues for making profit. Indian capitalists were denied investment or any role. Railways in India was also to increase the reach of British industries to far-flung areas, so that you can sell the goods to the villages and also procure raw materials. Railways would strengthen the foundation of British political rule. It would enable them to mobilize soldiers rapidly. It played an important role in the defense of the northwest frontier. If any rebellion happens, to suppress it. So with all these ideas in mind, commercial, political, all these ideas in mind, Dalhousie presented his famous minute in 1853. Minute means it is like a proposal. This proposal was the framework for the development of railway and the railway policy of British in India. And this minute was accepted by the British Parliament. And hence the first railway line was laid from Bombay to Thane. ये तो आप समझ गए. Now what is interesting is that, ये मैंने लिख भी दिया है, why economic, administrative, military, ये आपने देख लिया. When we talk about railways in India, an example of finance capitalism, was developed under the guarantee system. It was a unique instance of private investment but public risk. Investment, right from the day of the investment, all the investors were assured a minimum return of 5%, even before the operation starts. मतलब आपने 1 करोड़ रुपए लगाए रेलवे प्रोजेक्ट में, आपको 5% मिलना एनुअली शुरू. तो इसका मतलब जब तक रेलवे ऑपरेशन में नहीं आता, टिल द टाइम रेलवे इज ऑन अ रेवेन्यू मोड, ये पैसा कहां से जाएगा? हमारे इधर से जाएगा. This guarantee system was also contributed to the drain of wealth. Moderates have written on this. And then they were given 99-year lease that their stake will be there. Railways in India अब मैं चाहता हूं एक पॉइंट जरूर लिखें, बिकॉज इट इज इंपॉर्टेंट, दैट रेलवेज इन इंडिया not only had a political dimension, administrative dimension, military dimension, commercial dimension, but an ecological dimension also. Ramchandra Guha and Madhav Gadgil, two individuals have written extensively on ecological imperialism of during British rule. Ecological imperialism. That British rule also hurt or disrupted our ecological balance. And railways connection hai. How ecological? You will write that because of the need for more teak wood for the sleepers, train mein hote na sleepers. So they started changing the tree or the forest nature in many parts of Uttarakhand. Deforestation on wide scale started. बहुत सी स्टडीज हैं, मतलब in the history of India, not only British India, in the history of India, such massive scale deforestation had never happened until 19th century. और किसकी स्टडी है? Ramchandra Guha and Madhav Gadgil. So whenever you write on the ecological aspects, especially these aspects, you must quote these two. मैं आपको पढ़ाऊंगा इन पोस्ट इंडिपेंडेंस एनवायरमेंटलिज्म in post-independent India. And because of this massive deforestation, दो चीजें हो रही थी. One, deforestation, and second, the nature of the forest was changing. Why? Because they started planting one type of it, which obviously will affect the ecological balance. Because of massive deforestation, we see that the drainage patterns were affected. Many hilly regions became more vulnerable to landslides. ये लिखा है उनकी स्टडीज. So you must write about all this. And then, as I have already written, the drain of wealth हो ही रहा था, interest payments है ना. And railways facilitated deindustrialization. Now, these are the negative impact. What are the positive impact? The positive impact may, one, it increased connection, means it increased inter-regional trade, increased mobility of goods. Now, the good aspect about is that railways also attacked the prevailing social taboo of purity and pollution. Many people who would be very conscious, especially the upper caste Brahmins, now were forced to travel in the same railway compartment where this. So it did not abolish or it did not overthrow the caste system, but many false notions of purity and pollution were attacked. Railways enabled in the faster mobilization of people during the Indian national movement. Railways enabled people to travel crisscross. So we read that railways started as imperialism on wheels, but this wheel also became the transport, or this became the basis of rise of Indian nationalism. Role of railways. Because railways enabled people in different parts of India to interact with each other. And this interaction played an important role in the growth of consciousness. So national social mobility increased. So railways, yeah. Agreed. Now moving to the next, development of education during the British Raj. Very, very important. There are a number of committees, but usse zyada I want to focus on the policy measure. Development of education. Now, why the British promoted education? So we must understand that the British promoted education not because of philanthropy, not because of noble civilizing mission. It was driven by their interests. Education was also one of the policies and the tools by which the British wanted to strengthen and perpetuate their rule in India. समझिए, British rule in India was established through many ways. First is wars, then is economic control, railways. Education is also one of that. So education was introduced to suit their interest. इसलिए मैंने कहा to strengthen and perpetuate their rule. They were not interested in improving literacy. They were not interested in imparting Western rationalism, or they were not actually genuinely trying to modernize India. No. There was no initiative towards mass education. They needed to educate certain class of people for their own ends. पहले तो ये समझिए. Why I am telling this? That because when you write answers in history, in your introduction, generally you should start with this idea. This is what I told you, argument. Before when you start writing, you must start writing. अगर मान लीजिए education policy पे आ गया, तो आपको लिखना होगा that the British education policy in India was not a manifestation of their noble civilizing mission. It was not an act of philanthropy, but was driven by their interests and was a tool for strengthening and perpetuating the British rule in India. ये एक तरीका है. ये आप लिख सकते हैं that British education policy, उसके बाद आप फीचर्स में लिखेंगे, was not attempted towards modernization of India, was not towards development overall literacy, but to suit their interest. Introduction can be of many types. One of the ways of introduction is this also, where you explain. जैसे मैंने रेलवे में बताया, फेमाइन में मैंने बताया, it was not just this, it was ecological stress. ये बताया ना, इसको याद कर लीजिए, because this will be very good way to start your introduction. कल मैं आपको बताऊंगा how to write more and more. कल आप लिखेंगे, फिर मैं भी करूंगा, आपके साथ ही लिखेंगे. Now, when we talk about to serve their administrative, political, commercial and cultural objectives, जरा बताइए administrative क्या है? Administrative simple है, that they wanted officials at lower rung, because it was very costly to import and to bring or to employ Europeans. So they needed lower level bureaucrats, administrative, to rationalize their administrative cost. What is political? Very good. They realized that we will educate Indians in such a way that they will be Indians in blood and flesh, but English in outlook. So this would help them to deepen, because they will be more loyal. Very good. Commercial. Educated Indians will be better customers of British industrial goods, better customers of English industrial goods. Cultural, very good. Christian missionaries promoted education, Anglicists promoted education also as a tool for religious conversions. Very good, especially in the tribal belt. So you must know political, administrative, commercial, cultural, religious. Now, when we talk about the development of British educational policy in India, the first set of officials were Orientalists. So you read that from 1770s to 1820s, most of them were Orientalists. Orientalists, they said, to rule India better, know India better. समझिए इस बात को, ये आपको जो बिल्कुल याद रखना है. That when you talk about British education policy in India, it is driven by colonial interests. And we have just mentioned the colonial interests are political, administrative, commercial and culture. ठीक है. Then with respect to the British education policy in India, there were different outlook and views amongst Englishmen. ये जरूरी है, सब अलग अलग सोच रहे हैं. So what are these different views, guys? First is Orientalists. Orientalists क्या कहते हैं? To rule India better, know India better. Why they were putting so much emphasis on promoting native learning? Because they understood that the more we do it, the more we will be able to rule according to it. Then मैंने mention भी किया है that there is an Orientalist like H.H. Wilson. उनका मानना था that why we must promote native learning. I am talking about the Orientalist argument. So Orientalists like, अब जैसे that is why to promote native learning, we find that they have established educational institutions. जैसे Warren Hastings established Calcutta Madrasa. Warren Hastings established Calcutta Madrasa. Why? To promote Persian learning. Jonathan Duncan established what? Sanskrit College Banaras to study of Brahmanical text. And then Wellesley established the training school in India, that is Fort William. तो एक तो we have native learning institutions and that they did in their own capacity. They organized funds, मतलब अपना पैसा नहीं, मतलब foreign funds. There was no support. Second, we find that people like H.H. Wilson, जब हम पढ़ेंगे ना Orientalist, Anglicist debate, तो people like H.H. Wilson, ये why they were for promotion of native learning. They believe that this will enable to earn trust of Indians. This will enable to earn trust. Second, he said that because Indians as taxpayers must decide their education. And then he says that knowledge transmission is faster in native language. Faster in native language. ये उनका argument है. Then guys, we have evangelicals. That is Christian missionaries. आप लिख सकते हैं एग्जाम्पल एलेक्जेंडर डफ. क्रिश्चियन मिशनरीज क्या कह रहे थे? इंग्लिश एजुकेशन वुड एनेबल व्हाट? आउटलुक देखिए, नहीं. Then guys, third, we have Anglicist. Anglicists like Macaulay, they are saying English education. Why? Because one, administrative needs. It will cater to the administrative needs. Second, English education is scientific in its approach. It is modern. Macaulay, in his famous debate, जो आप पढ़ते हैं ना, Anglicist Orientalist debate, he said, "What will people learn by learning? What will they do by learning Sanskrit and Persian? It has no utility in administration, economy." And he had given that in very infamous statement that one shelf of English library is has much more knowledge than the entire library of Asia. कहा था. Because according to him, the modern English education, although they are not promoting science, would promote rationality, ये सब चीजें. So इनका ये मानना था, मैकॉले कहते. And then guys, there is one more school or one group of people like utilitarians. We have William Bentinck. नाम सुना है ना, गवर्नर जनरल. So William Bentinck, he said that English education would bring the benefits of good governance of British to India. Because they said that the Indian educational system and their legal system was backward. So even amongst them, with respect to the education, apart from the Orientalists, they have these views. Now another aspect, ये लिख लिया आप लोगों ने? Written? Another aspect which I want you to focus, that when we talk about their their education policy, they focused more on literary education, not on scientific education. They focused more on literary education, not on scientific education. They neglected mass education. They were not interested in mass literacy. They followed downward filtration theory. What is downward filtration theory? Yes, is handful of people. बस समझ गए? Very good. ये है British education policy neglect of vernacular education. यही आप पढ़ते हैं. I've mentioned here Bentinck's resolution. I'll show the right side. पहले लिख लीजिए. I'll show. Bentinck's resolution I've mentioned in 1835. जब ये Orientalist Anglicist debate खत्म हुआ, Macaulay came up with his minute no English education, downward filtration theory. We will be driven by our administrative needs, commercial needs, not by what emotions are saying. No. Then even Bentinck went, because Bentinck भी English education के. Bentinck कहाँ से? Utilitarians. तो दोनों, Bentinck is the Governor General and Macaulay was the law member in the Executive Council. So he says that yes, from henceforth there will be no state patronage, no state support to native learning. क्योंकि आप देखिए Orientalist का पहले दबाव था That is why the Charter Act ने कहा था कि 1 लाख per year will be devoted, but that was never consumed. Got it? So when you are asked that when we talk about the English educational policy, तो आपको ये बातें ध्यान रखनी है. Then there are commissions जो आप पढ़ सकते हो, वुड्स डिस्पैच, सैडलर कमीशन, है ना. एक टॉपिक जरूर पढ़ लीजिएगा, गांधी views on education, Tagore's views on education, and the Vardha plan. Please prepare it. If at all a question comes. Now, I would want you to tell me, and then we can move ahead. What was the impact of online students? Have you written? I can change this. Okay. Thank you. What was the impact of, go and देखिए सारी चीजें लिखी हैं, this whatever I said. Impact of British educational policy on India. Impact. So it's true that the British introduced the educational policy driven by their interest. But this benefited because this provided for the growth of educated middle class who internalized the benefits while remaining culturally rooted. Most would begin to work towards social reform, and this educated middle class will provide leadership to the freedom struggle. यहीं से शुरू होता है. But the first immediate impact which I have written is intellectual modernization. Means the educated middle class in India became aware of the progressive ideas of modernity in the West. Progressive outlook, while remaining culturally rooted. But on one hand we see intellectual modernization, but we also see there are episodes that some educated individuals were not only modernized but even westernized. They tried to mimic, copy the Western ways of life. Can you give me an example? Intellectual modernization is good. What is intellectual modernization? Means educated middle class imbibed the values of Western modernity. And this intellectual modernization later provided leadership for socio-religious reform movement, Indian Renaissance and the freedom struggle. लेकिन इसका negative भी है. You will write that it also led to cultural alienation also. Intellectual modernization has also, देखिए यहाँ लिखा भी है, cultural alienation. Means there are very good Derosians, very good Derosians. That is why they could not get social consent. मैं आपको कल पढ़ाऊंगा social religious reform movement. Social consent. नहीं मिल पाता है social consent. Then guys, because of the incorporation of English, gradually over a period of time, the nature of British or the social composition of the British administration will change. Bipan Chandra likhte hain that initially the ICS officials until 1921 were mostly Englishmen. But with the English education spreading, with the holding of examination in India, with the Indianization, bureaucrats were also mostly from Indian. Officials were mostly. So Indian population will be more and more in administration, in politics also. English became a bridge language which enabled diverse linguistic communities to interact, and this bridge language became the political language of Indian nationalism. इस भाषा में लिखिए. So you can write in bullets. So I have also written for you in bullets that English would become the political language. But the problem is that in spite of all the good things, this elite bias always remained. Because of inadequate support, we find that mass literacy was a problem. Illiteracy, sorry. At the time of independence, can you guess what was the percentage of the population which was illiterate? 83%. And उसमें भी women illiteracy is higher, 94%. ये प्रॉब्लम तो है ना. At the time of independence, illiteracy was a problem. 83% of India's population was illiterate in 1947 at the time of independence, and 94%. तो ये है education policy. Very good. Now this is a topic which I guess, if at all, whenever it will be asked, it will be a difficult. So why not to prepare 1 or 2 slides on this? है ना, इस पर कुछ काम क्यों ना कर लिया जाए? Because education is something जो बार-बार आता ही है. But we have understood the larger dimension. अब है development of science. Because I told you very categorically that the British were not interested in imparting scientific idea because rational outlook to Indians. But still, over a period of time, there was development of certain scientific research. Some institutions, some streams came up. The question is why? जैसे British set up engineering colleges, ISM Dhanbad, agreed? HBT College Kanpur, पढ़ते ना? Botanical research, geological survey. Why were they doing this? What is your guess? Do you think that they were looking? Yes, बोलिए.
So that new technology can be used by Indian.
No.
By the
They were actually looking for more ways to exploit Indian resources. बोलिए.
And they also want assistance from the Indians, so that the British officials who are coming from England, they are supported from the local resources from these educated class to have more research, in-depth research, because the climatic differences are also different between England and India also.
अच्छा, ठीक है. देखिए, when you talk about the development of science during British Raj, British did not focus on theoretical research. Theoretical research was happening in Britain, but India was a data collection center. पहला ये है. India was a field of laboratory for the British scientific research. पहला ये है. समझ में आ रहा है? Data collection. They were doing a lot of study. Second, I've mentioned also the British researches or the development of science was driven by their economic policies. Economic means what more resources are there? Minerals. इसलिए जियोलॉजी, ज्योग्राफी, माइनिंग, मेटलर्जी और इंजीनियरिंग में भी उन्होंने सिविल इंजीनियरिंग की पढ़ाई करवाई. Why? Because that would enable them to construct रेलवे सिर्फ नहीं, ports. Botanical research because they wanted to find medicines to a number of diseases. They could understand that in a country with rich flora, they can find out medicinal herbs. Botanical research, geological survey. समझ रहे इस बात को? So it was driven by their needs. India was a land of sampling and resource mapping, data collection. They discouraged theoretical research. It was driven by their utility. पहली बात ये समझिए. Agreed? This is something that I wanted to tell. इसलिए मैंने लिख भी दिया. देखिए, neglected research and development, theoretical science. देखिए, जहां जहां मेरे को याद आया मैंने लिख दिया वहां पे. So that in the notes you can see yourself. And even when research institutions or educational institutions were established, creative freedom or research freedom was very less. जो भी institutes आए, HBT, ISM Dhanbad, their bureaucrats were controlling. That is what I have written. Bureaucrats control over scientific know-how, because of which there was limited intellectual freedom. For them, curative health was not a priority. There was curative health मतलब कोई बीमारी का इलाज कैसे करें, preventive health पे ध्यान नहीं दे रहे. जैसे I'll tell you, Ronald Ross discovered a malaria mosquito in India. So first thing I want you to understand that which are the subjects they promoted. They promoted subjects like civil engineering, mining, botanical research, geology, geography, metallurgy. because this would enable them to. But in spite of the British, over a period of time, a class of Indians or a group of Indians emerged who made remarkable developments or contributions in the field of science and technology. आपने स्वदेशी मूवमेंट में तो पढ़ ही दिया है, प्रफुल्ल चंद्र रे, बंगाल में पढ़ा है जेसी बोस, है ना. So when we talk about the development of science by the Indian community, despite all these handicaps or limitations, so I'll start with Rajaram Mohan Roy. Rajaram Mohan Roy from the beginning promoted Western education because he wanted that Western rationality and scientific outlook should be imparted. Hence, he with David Hare set up the college. पढ़ते हैं आप? Rajaram Mohan Roy, who is called as the father of Indian Renaissance, was a modernist. Then I will teach tomorrow that in the socio-religious reform movement, when they started advocating on women rights, sometimes people like reformers like Akshay Kumar Dutt, he gave medical grounds why female should not marry below a age. Therefore, they understood that if you want to attack, if you want to reduce these episodes of child marriage, we must promote medical education amongst the masses. Do you understand? So even reformers understood the value of medical education. But then there was conservative element. वो बाद में हम देखेंगे. Then we find that even Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, he set up the Aligarh Scientific Society 1864 because he could see that the Muslim population in terms of modern education is lacking. So some very important initiatives from 19th century. Then 20th century, you can see Indian Association for Cultivation of Science 1876. फिर देखिए. Then Tata set up the IISc Bangalore 1909 for promoting theoretical research in mathematics, physics, है ना, ये सब चल रहा है. Swadeshi movement also promoted the idea of scientific nationalism because it was realized that without the growth of modern science, we will not be able to progress. Prafull Chandra Ray set up the Bengal Chemicals and Pharmaceutical Factory, example है ना. Then you see Swadeshi Steam Navigation Company. So some development was happening despite all this. And then the name of some of the prominent scientists, J.C. Bose, you know that he discovered the signals within plants, demonstrated wireless transmission. ये सब थोड़ा पढ़ लीजिएगा, ठीक है? C.V. Raman, the scattering of light. Then Indians also started this Indian Science Congress. ये अभी भी होता है, 1914 से शुरू हुआ, where the scientific research and export or exchange of ideas could be promoted. So all these aspects are there, development of it. ठीक है, तो ये पढ़ लीजिएगा. Now guys, before we move to the constitutional development, because इस बार एक दो question आ गया, and it happens that when question comes in prelims from an area, they are more likely to ask that in mains also. So before we move to these three aspects, constitutional development, I think I should start with Gandhi. मैं बाकी भी कराऊंगा, don't worry. Capitalist women, ये हम करेंगे, don't worry. But I must start with Gandhi ji. Leftist, ये सब है थोड़ा भी. We have some portion to be done. Subhash Chandra Bose, है ना, Gandhi. And tomorrow you will have the print also. तो भी गांधी करते हैं. It is mentioned most of the things. In the galaxy of great leaders that India had during their freedom struggle, undoubtedly the brightest star that was shining was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. A person who made the Indian national movement truly a mass movement. समझिए, गांधी जी के बहुत से मूवमेंट्स हैं, some pan India level, some regional, and questions have been asked, and I'm sure you would have read about Champaran, Ahmedabad, Kheda, Rowlatt, NCM, Bardoli Satyagraha, civil disobedience movement, Harijan campaign. Quit India movement was also a movement in which, although Gandhi ji was arrested the next day, but he was the undisputed leader of it. ये तो movement तो पढ़ रखा ना आपने सारे causes. What I want you to understand is the underlying dimensions, so that when you write answer on any of the Gandhian movement, you understand his ideology, why he was doing it. That will make your answer better. Okay. So when I talk about Gandhian political ideology, Gandhian philosophy, what made Gandhi ji a very effective and a successful mass leader? क्या लगता है आपको? मैंने लिखा है काफी चीजें. Why do you think? Why Gandhi was so effective? बताइए ना जरा, बोलिए ना जरा. Why Gandhi ji was so effective?
So after coming back from South Africa, he studied entire India, and then he went through the problems and the problem facing by the Indians with the British Raj, and then he started non-violence. Everything is without violence.
अच्छा, और बताइए ऑनलाइन स्टूडेंट्स, प्लीज टेल मी.
He focused on mass movement,
मास मूवमेंट इसके पहले नहीं था? एक्सट्रीमिस्ट, कास्ट मूवमेंट.
moral values, non-violence.
व्हाट मेड गांधी सो स्पेशल? फटाफट बताइए, जिसको जल्दी करना है. टुडे विल कंप्लीट इन गांधी. यस, दैट्स ट्रू. फिर है involved all sections. How was he able to involve all sections?
Because he first applied those principles
Himself.
on
He was a brutally honest man, so people trusted him.
Yeah, people's favorite.
वही तो पूछ रहे हैं भाई. देखिए समझिए, why Gandhi was so effective. सबसे पहला, he was a political scientist. You must not forget this. Invented new methods of struggle. I'll tell you what are the struggles. सबसे पहला है सत्याग्रह. मैं पढ़ाने वाला हूं सत्याग्रह क्या है. Boycott, extensive boycott. Boycott means boycott of certain commodities or one area. Extensive means all around, है ना, जो आपको NCM में दिखता है. Then civil disobedience. Agreed? Civil disobedience. Then hunger strike. So there was always a level of excitement amongst masses that this time we are going to do it in a different way. And there was always uncertainty and an element of surprise for the British. तो पहले तो ये समझो, Gandhi was a political scientist. Level of excitement and element of surprise. Second, Gandhi ji from his arrival in India was seen as a millenarian. Gandhi ji was seen as a millenarian. What do you mean by millenarian? Masiha. Because of his South Africa success and his early success in Champaran, Ahmedabad, Kheda, people began to believe that Gandhi ji can do anything. wonders. Some even believed that he had divine powers. The tribals of Andhra region, they believed this. Some believed that wearing Gandhian cap made them immune from the British bullets. Third, Gandhiji, his physical attire and demeanor reflected a common man, and he addressed masses in common language. Although he was a barrister, but he was anything but a barrister in front of masses. So mass connect was easy. Isn't it? Mass connect was easy. Then Gandhi was a mystique, Behrupiya. Even his close followers would not guess his next move. आप देखो बहुत बार ऐसा हुआ है. When NCM was at its peak, because of his own arguments, he called it off. है ना? अब यूपीएससी इस पे सवाल कैसे पूछेगा? That Gandhian view of non-violence, or Gandhiji called off the NCM because of Chauri Chaura. But when so much of violence was going on during Quit India movement was not called off. ये पूछ सकता है, हम देखेंगे. He was a mystique. Civil disobedience movement चल रहा है. Suddenly he will pause and go and discuss with Mr. Gandhi Irwin. So this element of mystique was always there. And then Gandhi, why he was so effective? Because Gandhi combined politics with morality. है ना? With the issue of social reform, with religion and economic development. Gandhian movement was never only a political movement, it had multiple dimensions. That is what you were saying, that he was addressing multiple issues with one. That is why he was able to integrate many sections. So पहले तो ये समझिए. I want you to appreciate and understand why Gandhiji was so effective. Then we move. Now, when we talk about the beginning of Gandhian politics in India, just understand, from 1917 onwards, Champaran Satyagraha. Uske pehle bhi, when he was in South Africa, he used to come. He came in contact with the Congress leaders, but his active political phase in India begins with the Champaran. With the Champaran. So, when we talk about the arrival of Gandhi, this was the beginning of a political transition or a structural change in the nature of Indian politics. That is very important. And what is this change? Before Gandhi, Indian politics was a politics of studied limitation, means it had one dimension. Moderates will go with constitutional struggle. Extremists will go with mass movement, but with one dimension. It was before Gandhi a politics which was limited to certain pockets of India. The presidencies were more active. Although the Swadeshi movement attempt was made, but it was largely confined to Bengal and few pockets of Punjab and Maharashtra. It was a politics of classes, not of masses in true sense. From there we see that a person comes with a lot of laurels success in South Africa with promises, and at a time when people are feeling disconnect with the Congress leadership. The arrival of Gandhi was not in political vacuum and was in a political vacuum. दोनों को बात समझिए. Was not in a political vacuum मतलब ऐसा नहीं कि गांधी जीरो से शुरू करते हैं. कांग्रेस पार्टी had created an organizational base, although it was discredited after the Surat split, but there was some. And why Gandhiji started from a political vacuum? Because the circumstances were such that people were frustrated with the wartime difficulties, Defense of India Act 1915, suppressed freedom of speech, liberty, inflation was high, profiteering, hoarding was going on. ये लिखा है यहाँ पे. Rural distress, देखिए लिखा है. Famines or this, and masses were disillusioned with the Congress politics, and his South African success created a lot of promise. So Gandhiji, when he came, Congress was in shambles. Moderate extremist thing was still had to be resolved. Home rule movement was going on, but somehow the home rule movement could not connect with the masses. The program was such. But one thing that very good that Home Rule League did is that it provided a organizational connect between rural India and urban India, which he will use in his Rowlatt Satyagraha. Now, one thing that also separated Gandhiji from his predecessors is what I've written very categorically, that Gandhiji's politics was rooted in India's cultural ethos. Unlike the early leaders who tried to bring the Western political ideas in India, Gandhiji said no. Although he was Western educated. But Gandhiji's politics rejected Western political thought. It was rooted, that is what we'll see. He has brought India's culture, religion, everyday experiences. And one thing that I forgot to mention, aap likh lo zarur, that why Gandhiji was effective is because Gandhiji's ability was his ability to understand masses' strength and channelize them. And channelize. His unique his ability to look into the people's mind and heart and understand. Yeah, that is why he was able to bring together everyone. अब आगे बढ़ते हैं. Let's move ahead. Now we have to discuss a bit of the Gandhian ideas because movement आपको समझ में आ रहा है. Gandhiji talks about civilizational pluralism. Civilizational pluralism means he says that India's civilization is a civilization of acceptance, tolerance, syncretism. We have been living together peacefully and happily for centuries. And we have to develop this civilizational outlook. That is why Gandhi, when he talks about Swaraj, Gandhian Swaraj also talks about civilizational nationalism, shared historical past. पहली बात है. Now, sometimes in prelims they ask, but I want you to remember that what were the various influences which shaped his political ideas. Yes, it was also an outcome of his own intuitive thinking, but what are the various influences? So I have mentioned some of the important books or the characters who have influenced his life. First is John Ruskin's book, Unto This Last, which gave him two important messages. One is dignity of labor, that the work of a laborer, the work of a barrister, the work of a bureaucrat, every work is important. इसीलिए आप देखिए बाद में गांधी जो है चरखा एडवोकेट करते हैं, because चरखा which everybody must spin at least for 1 hour, it humbles you, it shows that dignity of labor. सबका Then Gandhiji, his John Ruskin's unto this last also talks about the aspect of सर्वोदया, welfare of all. जो concept आता है ना वो यहीं से आता है, देखिए यहाँ पे लिखा भी है मैंने, that good of an individual lies in the good of the community. और जिसको गांधी में आप कहते, गांधीयन थॉट में आप कहते हैं सर्वोदया, welfare of all. Then Henry David Thoreau's essay Civil Disobedience influenced his political movements. Henry David Thoreau's book Civil Disobedience says that when any political system is unjust, people have a right to disobey and question the unjust laws. आप पढ़ते हो ना सिविल डिसोबीडियंस मूवमेंट. व्हाट इज सिविल डिसोबीडियंस मूवमेंट? सिविल डिसोबीडियंस और नॉन कोऑपरेशन में क्या फंडामेंटल डिफरेंस है? What is the fundamental difference? Non-cooperation movement. बोलिए बोलिए.
Boycott of the British and policies in non-cooperation, civil disobedience, break the laws.
Not laws, unjust laws. So it is the radicalization of Gandhian politics. आप देखोगे Gandhian politics में हर फेज पिछले फेज से ज्यादा radical है, extreme है. Because he knew that in one instance we cannot acquire independence. People don't have that capacity. So it was like a movement which was spiraling out, growing in its expanse, mass participation and also the degree of radicalization. अब देखिए limited movement से बढ़ रहा है. Then Leo Tolstoy, The Kingdom of God Within You, has inspired him immensely on non-violence. Leo Tolstoy was from aristocratic background who has written extensively on peasant issues. बाद में रशियन रेवोल्यूशन में भी लेनिन कहते हैं कि लियो टॉल्स्टॉयज राइटिंग्स हैव इंस्पायर्ड the socialist revolution, especially with respect to peasant issues. But why Gandhiji was inspired from Tolstoy? Because Tolstoy talks about non-violence. Even in Russia, we will discuss, where feudalism was very strong, he said that peasants must get back their land. But how? Through non-violence. We'll understand Gandhian non-violence की बात क्यों करते हैं गांधी. So radical Christian humanism, turning the other cheek. गांधी जी गुजरात से थे, जहां पे वैष्णविज्म बहुत पॉपुलर था, वहां पे जैन कम्युनिटी भी था. So that is why we see that his mother, Katputli Bai, from his childhood imbibed these ideas of Vaishnavism and also Jaina. So non-violence, asceticism, empathy, satyagraha, ये बातें वहां से भी आती हैं. भगवत गीता से निष्काम कर्म. So you must understand, whenever you write, if you find writing an answer related to, तो आप कहीं पर ये ideological influence जरूर लाएं. It would make your answer more enriched. Now, what is the meaning of Swaraj according to Gandhi? Swaraj क्या है? Gandhi ji gave a larger definition of Swaraj. गांधी जी कहते हैं स्वराज इज नॉट जस्ट पॉलिटिकल इंडिपेंडेंस, इट मींस सेल्फ रूल, सेल्फ रेस्ट्रेंट, एम्पावरमेंट ऑफ पीपल. सो गांधी जी स्वराज is not something that was limited to political or economic ideals, because स्वराज का इंटरप्रिटेशन मल्टीपल है. स्वराज अकॉर्डिंग टू बाल गंगाधर तिलक इज डिफरेंट, स्वराज अकॉर्डिंग टू एनी बेसेंट इज डिफरेंट, अकॉर्डिंग टू सोशलिस्ट इज डिफरेंट, अकॉर्डिंग टू गांधी इज डिफरेंट. तो गांधी जो है अपनी किताब में लिखते हैं हिंदू स्वराज में, व्हाट इज स्वराज, बिकॉज ही वांटेड टू इनकलकेट सर्टेन वैल्यूज amongst the Indian community. He talks about empowerment of all. समझ गए? So when you talk about Gandhian Swaraj, अब देखिए struggle true struggle. Why did Gandhi ji adopt this struggle true struggle strategy? पढ़ते ना STS. बोलिए. Very good. Struggle means the active phase जहां पे movement चल रहा है. Truce is the phase of constructive work, and then possibly the preparation for the next movement. Just say NCM is struggle. Then the period from suspension of NCM to the Bardoli Satyagraha, or you can say CDM, is the truce where constructive work. Now I have given a very another analogy for STS. अगर कभी ये आया तो जरूर लिखना. That Gandhian STS was a STS. This strategy was a Gandhian chemotherapy to the British cancer. ये मैंने लिखा है. British cancer मैं क्यों लिख रहा हूं? Why I have written this? Because we know that British rule in India was multifaceted and deeply ingrained. British rule in India was multifaceted and deeply ingrained. Means there was a political dimension, there was an economic dimension, there was a religious dimension, cultural dimension, psychological dimension, social dimension. So British rule in India was deeply entrenched. Many people believed that British rule is good for us. And British rule were everywhere, all powerful. So इस rule को हटाना एक बार में आसान नहीं है. And he knew, as your friend rightly said, that he understood that is what his strength. He did not ask people to do something extraordinary. He knew that after all, after a few months, they would want to go back to their normal life. A farmer has to go back to the field. A woman has to go back and take care of her family. A capitalist will not want mass radicalization beyond the point because his capitalist interest will be hurt. और उनको ये भी पता था कि जब कोई मूवमेंट प्रोलॉन्ग होता है, जब कैंसर को हटाना होता है, तो कीमोथेरेपी में क्या होता है? इंटेंस मूवमेंट के बाद रेस्ट, फिर मूवमेंट. Agreed? So you can write this. Pressure compromise and STS linked. So during struggle, pressure was applied. And Gandhiji did not believe in the achieving victory and outcome in one hand because he knew he was more driven by, or also driven, not more, driven by the intended victory and moral victory. इसीलिए आप देखिए चंपारण सत्याग्रह में, when they agreed to return 25% of illegal dues, he called it a moral victory and said, in the Ahmedabad mill strike, the workers were initially demanding 50% of wage increase, 35 पे मान गया. So this was his strategy because the idea of pressure compromise was to build up the momentum, spiraling out movement. ठीक है, ठीक से. Continue from here because we have another session here. कोई बात नहीं, आप आज डाउनलोड कर लेना इसको, है ना, and revise whatever is there. In the 3 hours we have covered many topics. I will complete Gandhiji, role of various factions, constitutional development, and then the last debate, freedom and partition. Agreed? So please do it, and we'll meet tomorrow again at first for the answer writing session, है ना, थोड़ा पढ़ लीजिएगा, है ना. We'll do a live answer writing session. I will tell you how to write. Thank you all.